Okay, here we go. So three, another little video to help with the assessment, the knowledge for work with diverse people. So we're up to question 5. Question A, 5A. In what situation would you use a language and cultural interpreters and provide a real example? So in class we spoke about the use of an interpreter, perhaps working with someone from a non-English speaking background. You might be meeting them for the first time, going out perhaps even a home visit, and there would be a need for an interpreter to understand what that person was wanting, requiring, needing. 5B, when would you use imagery? And we did speak about a few examples. One in particular comes to mind with perhaps sexual health education with young people with a intellectual disability, and there were some really good visual resources available from Family Planning New South Wales on their website, and we did have a look at those. And there's a few other examples. Pictures, flip charts, or sometimes called flip charts, or picture books, or sometimes called Compics, to help people with or young people was the example, with a learning disability or an intellectual disability of some sort of developmental disability, and so to communicate their needs they would point to particular pictures. So it could be perhaps using the bathroom or needing some food, water as examples, and that have appropriate pictures to point to. So there is a couple of examples for 5. Number 6 and 3, changing cultural practices in Australia. The first one we spoke about was the inclusion of people with a disability in Australian society or Australian community, and I guess the changing practices. We think back or research back into the 70s, 1970s, early 80s and prior to that, and the approach would have been a larger institution in many cases, and people were segregated and kept away from society. We spoke about the influences, things like there was a thing called the Richmond Report in 1983 that outlined the need for people to be included fully in community, regardless of disability. There's been political pressure, there's been activism. The NDIS would be another influence in terms of making sure that people with a disability are included fully in the community and full life. There's now a lot of, well, there has been, but services that provide support for people in contexts such as employment seeking or keeping a job in open employment. A lot of different services have sprung up as a result of the NDIS and providing that support. So what do we see as the impact? Do we see a lot more acceptance in the community and politically to include people fully who have a disability? And we have access, so things like access to buildings, access to services, access to employment, whether it be through attitudes, legislation, and the built environment being more inclusive. So there's a little snapshot on the inclusion of people with a disability in that table, in table 6. So continuing on with table 6, other examples where we might have seen a change in practice. So inclusion and participation and around the rights of women. So influences, think about what's been an influence in that sphere. So things like getting the vote, the suffragette movement, changing legislation. We're looking at some political debate and education around respectful relationships at the moment. So I guess, and then look at the impacts there, whether it's around women having access to employment, the changing roles in families, or sharing the load in families, more respectful relationships, hopefully. As other examples, and I'll let you think about the influences and the impact, but there were things around the same-sex marriage equality was brought up, so think about the influences from things like Mardi Gras, mainstream coverage, high-profile people coming out and the impact there. Multiculturalism, so we've moved to a policy of multicultural Australia in the early 70s, and through to waves of different immigrants or refugees from Vietnamese into the late 70s, early 80s, through to the more African-based nations in the mid-90s, through to more recent times, and the impacts that's had on us as a society, and how that filters through into our education about diversity, our experiences of diversity in schools and employment settings, perhaps our language and our understanding of the world and where we fit into it as examples. First Nations peoples and changing practices and influence are certainly some milestones in terms of legislation, so getting the right to vote in 63, being granted full citizenship in 67, things like land rights movements, walking across the bridge in protest of recognition, Kevin Rudd's Apology to the Stolen Generations, 2007. We're moving on to the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and you'd have to think through and look at those impacts. Other changing practices could be around age, what have been influences and impacts there. So that's a snapshot there. This question relates to your appreciation of diversity and inclusiveness within your workplace. Give 2 examples how you value and respect diversity and inclusiveness in your work. It could be about being respectful of people, using their appropriate name or pronoun if you're working with people from who are perhaps in that transitioning community, transgender. That would be respectful, would be having those open conversations with a colleague, perhaps a colleague from a different cultural background, and making sure that you're understanding the appropriateness around things like personal space or gestures or touch even. Explain how you contribute to the development of workplace and professional relationships based on appreciation of diversity and inclusiveness. That's in the professional sense, so that could be things like attending meetings and training, workplace training around inclusiveness, cross-cultural practice. It could be making efforts to get a guest speaker or guest presenter at a staff meeting, someone who's from a different cultural background or a different cultural group, to provide some sort of group cultural training. So you might initiate that. That would show your professional commitment to inclusiveness and diversity in the workplace. Identify 2 workplace practices that make environments safe for all. So that could be participating in workplace inspections, and particularly in making sure that workplaces are safe. People with a physical disability and may have access challenges, perhaps using a wheelchair. It could be about using appropriate documentation to report WHS issues, and doing that in a respectful and appropriate person-centered language. So D, what strategies do you use to ensure you show respect when communicating with people from diverse backgrounds? So again, the LGBTQIA+ community, it could be things like using the appropriate pronoun or the preferred name that people want to be known by. It could be about appropriate body language, eye contact, different space, maybe gender differences between cultures, and respecting that. Could be about asking people would they prefer to see a male or a female, perhaps, when they're talking to staff. Identify 2 strategies you could use to communicate effectively when a language barrier exists. That's right, we've spoken about that earlier, but it could be the use of pictures, it could be the use of an interpreter. Now F, give 2 examples of social and cultural impacts that may occur when there is a cross-cultural misunderstanding. So if there's a cross-cultural misunderstanding, it could be that people lose faith in the service, they don't want to attend, they become frustrated or angry, want to withdraw. But yeah, if there's misunderstandings, it could lead to some negative, strong emotions and withdrawal. Identify 2 actions that you could take as a worker to sensitively resolve cross-cultural differences when a misunderstanding occurs. So I guess the idea of being open and discussing it with a person, perhaps there may be a need for a mediator or a support person, looking at getting maybe someone who speaks more than one language, multilingual, to help communicate. So some sort of appropriate mediator, preferably with that cultural knowledge. Question 8. So you've got to reflect on your own cultural background and beliefs. Describe one cultural view or bias that you may have and why you think you have this opinion. So this one I showed a short video, and that'll be in the video 1 on the iTAFE link, or it's up on the YouTube channel, but you can access it through iTAFE as video 1 from week 2, and I sort of pull apart some of the influences that I was exposed to as a younger person. A lot of the commercial television advertising, selling soft drinks in particular, was certainly presenting gender in certain ways, and I think that would have shaped my view. Other views that I spoke about, and I'm not even sure where they came from in some ways. By the time I was in early primary school, I would have had a negative view of the police and authority, and it's hard to put a finger where that came from. Was that through family? I'm not so sure. Probably media or TV, perhaps what I was watching on television, but I'm not totally sure. Was it about just my interactions with other peers at school? Perhaps that was more the main influence, but it's a tricky one for me to get my head around, where I had that negative view of authority and police, teachers, things like that. As I got older, certainly into high school, there would be the negative attitudes and talk around the LGBTQIA plus community, where that stemmed from. I guess things like jokes, comments, put downs. Certainly exposed to that, and so yeah, you get that framework that's not okay, and how that impacted on me personally. Yeah, things like, I guess, if you're questioning your sexual identity and concerns as a 13-year-old, and so that sort of reflects people who do identify back then perhaps as gay, as an example, and then having to stay in the closet, so to speak, not being able to come out. So there's a fair bit of discussion in that video about reflecting and what that means. So if you're a worker and you've not reflected on your cultural background or learned about other cultural backgrounds, what could happen in your communication? So I guess primarily you might say stuff that's offensive, make comments, remarks that are derogatory to other groups, other diverse groups, whether they be from a cultural background, sexually diverse background, as 2 examples. Perhaps you're not able to recognise discrimination so easily, and whether that's across gender, culture, ethnicity, age, etc. Identify 2 ways to improve your self and social awareness. Well, certainly thinking about it, perhaps doing some education and training, cross-cultural courses, reflecting on the attitudes and values and where they've come from and those influences. You should be able to reflect on your own biases and attitudes and behaviours, and be able to learn others, and then be able to be more mindful about behaving in a culturally appropriate way. Understanding that you have your own ideas and views, and checking that they're based in, I guess, orality and not just on, I guess, popular culture, whether it's social media or negative comments or stereotypes that you might be exposed to, and those perceptions are, you've got to just check that your perceptions are not skewed or biased, and that's not leading your behaviour and your interactions with others. Social expectations, we did spend a bit of time looking at that as well, and I guess certain groups, there might be negative expectations in a sense, or things that you may have experienced or seen firsthand that are negative. But be able to move beyond that, if you're working with those people from those disadvantaged groups. We spoke about young people perhaps in social housing or disadvantaged communities. They may be out late at night and doing negative things, or making you cranky when you go to fill up petrol at the servo and they give you a gobful, perhaps something like that. So maybe there's a set of social expectations around certain groups that are negative, and so if you're able to see the bigger picture, that there's also experiences in those people's lives that might explain some of that behaviour, whether it's parents with a disability or low social options like employment, disadvantage, poverty, and then those people perhaps feel trapped or disempowered, and to get power back maybe it comes out through poor behaviour. But I guess if we're trying to build a relationship, we've got to see beyond the negative behaviour, see the person first, and try and engage and work with the positives and the strengths. So being mindful of those negative social expectations, I think, is where we ended up there. Okay. So in question 10, I think we spoke about, you could perhaps give you 3 examples of 3 different skills or strategies to be inclusive with your communication in the one exchange. So we spoke about if you're meeting and working with someone with a disability who might use a wheelchair, perhaps they came with a carer and even had maybe some sort of speech difficulty or communication difficulty. However, to be respectful, we would be speaking to the person, not the carer, speaking to the person, showing that respect, but we would use careful, clear language, and we might even check that they understand and that they're clear, so using those good open communication skills, the active listening skills. Perhaps we do write things down and perhaps even use pictures in an attempt to still engage with that person and let them have their voice rather than turning to the carer. So yeah, a person-centred approach where possible. Also perhaps looking at working with an Aboriginal person, perhaps an older male coming to your service, and you know that person is an elder. We spoke about the respectfulness use of the term uncle or auntie for females, but we had a little bit of discussion about my information of recent years was that, yeah, Aboriginal people who are elders are quite okay with a non-Aboriginal person calling them uncle or auntie, seeing that as a sign of respect. Maybe in that case, if you're working with an Aboriginal fellow, perhaps greeting them with uncle, hello uncle, acknowledging that they may be uncomfortable coming to a welfare service, given that there's been some problematic histories in the past and that may, have intergenerational trauma impacts, so stolen generations, for example, and if we're in some sort of welfare role, we might be viewed with mistrust, and acknowledging that up front, and acknowledging that if we can try and find an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander worker, if that would be more appropriate, and seeking whether that would be something that the uncle would be happy with, just some examples, yeah, and just be mindful of all those things in the communication. So that's 10. 11, we spoke about the relationship with human needs and human rights. And human needs, we spoke about Maslow, the hierarchy of needs. Down the bottom of that hierarchy are things like food, shelter, water, sex, I think, is down that bottom layer. And then human rights being, for me, human rights would be enshrined in some sort of legislation, whether it's a universal declaration of human rights or the rights of the child, or more localised laws around inclusion and diversity and non-discrimination. But in a sense, those laws are about upholding a person's needs. But that might mean, the need is food and shelter, and, the right to get some sort of housing could be enshrined in law, some sort of emergency housing, doing the best to meet people's basic needs, enshrined through our laws, our human rights laws. So, yeah, what do we need to survive, and how do we ensure that it happens, that interrelationship between human needs and human rights? The next one is a table. I've got a handout for 12, and 13 is a little bit complicated. I might leave the video there, and that will hopefully help you get up to speed if you missed session 2. Toodle pips.